Thank you all so much for joining me today to hear about my thoughts and learning about both the need and the opportunity to embrace lived expertise in our conversations, practices, and advocacy, specifically related to mental health and neurodiversity. I want to start also by talking a little bit about what I mean when I say neurodiversity. I know there's a lot of different perspectives and approaches to this word. But the history of the word is that it emerges from the collective organizing of physical and physical disability and mental difference activists to shift the discussion about our brains and bodies away from one that was focused on what is wrong with us and what needs to be fixed, to one that considered the fact that we all have different ways of thinking and experiencing the world. And they emphasize that there is not a normal brain or mind, just like there is not a normal or right culture, and that everybody, regardless of how their brain operates, has deserves dignity, self-autonomy, physical and emotional well-being, including, and this is important for my presentation, freedom from stigma. These activists also argued that disability is determined by our social context rather than by our individual brains. Again, everybody should be able to access an environment that they need to thrive and a life without stigma, regardless of how they function. I use the term mental difference and diversity. There's a lot of different approaches to this word and to the phrasing that we use when we have these conversations. This is what feels right to me, but I recognize that people have a variety of complex understandings of how they refer to themselves and their own abilities and brains. And I don't mean to say that this is the only way to refer to ourselves. So I'd like to start that despite this complexity in how we talk about mental differences, we really only hear a very narrow perspective, even I would say within the homelessness response system sometimes. And I argue that we need to change this to move forward to a world where everyone is housed, no one is stigmatized, and everyone has access to the support they need to thrive. While 90% of news articles in some recent research referred to experts who were men, 70% of those quoted experts in news articles were white men, and only 17% of direct quotes referred to people with lived expertise of homelessness or mental differences. And so why does this matter? Like I said, to get to a place where everybody has their needs met, I think we need to move past stigma and the lack of complexity that traditional conversations about mental illness create. And I think that lived expertise in particular can point us toward the resources that people need to thrive and the trust that neurodiverse people have contributions and important insights to our movement towards justice. And again, there's a lot of complexity in how people think about and frame their own experiences of their own experiences. And there's many organizations and experts out there who are already trying to break down the stigma that prevent us from ensuring that everyone has access to what they need. These folks argue that anyone can thrive given the right social context and the right conditions, and that certain brains do not necessarily need to be cured, medicated, or hospitalized, and that this approach can also lead to better outcomes and achieve our goals of housing and economic and racial justice. Research says that approaching neurodiverse people as people with diseases, which is sort of what the dominant approach has been over the past few decades, really, doesn't actually reduce stigma. And I want to point to sort of why that actually matters. By emphasizing policies to address the narrative that our society is disabling, rather than emphasizing that people are the problem that we have to solve, we can move closer to better outcomes. And I think that this probably sounds familiar to folks who are really familiar with the housing space, because we often talk about the fact that bad housing policy rather than individual choices are what lead to homelessness. And so in the same way, I think the stigma of mental illness as an individual problem has deeply contributed to criminalization and institutionalization. And this isn't, from my perspective, a good thing. And I think it's made worse by the fact that these outcomes are not equitable. Both access to therapy and care, as well as the outcomes of treatment, and the rates of involuntary commitment and incarceration are highly determined by things like race, gender, and class. To be more specific, people of color, queer people, and low-income people end up in jail, are mandated medication, and have adverse experiences within these systems, within therapeutic what the systems that are supposed to be therapeutic, at a much higher rate, because the history of mental health in the United States is one that assigns antisocial actions to illness. So things like, from our history, things like fleeing slavery, advocating for the women's right to vote, demanding gender-affirming care, these were all or continue to be viewed as forms of illness. So recreating these same systems that strip autonomy and stigmatize behaviors re-traumatizes and exacerbates inequality and homelessness. And again, I want to emphasize that lived expertise tells us that people are different, and some people can really benefit from and need medication, and other people may benefit from intensive inpatient therapy. I'm not arguing against that. What I'm arguing against is categorizing people as ill, because that's a largely arbitrary term, and it's determined by our society, not by individuals. And I don't think that these narratives and these policies are in our interest, because they do not support the people that we all are trying to support. So instead, there's an opportunity for us to change the narrative and support our people better. Instead of defining someone as ill until they change, we could ask instead how we can help this person function and thrive where they are at and in whatever brain that they have. And maybe the answer is medication for some people, but trusting a person's lived expertise can guide us a lot better than assuming that all of our community's brains need to behave and function in a certain way. And this benefits all of us. Research also shows that neurodiverse groups and environments that create inclusion for everyone also benefit everyone. They produce better results when we ask how to accommodate someone rather than try and eliminate the differences that are there in that group. And I only have 10 minutes, so I can't get into too many details, but I'm going to do my best to talk a little bit about how we can facilitate this. We know that people need support, and we know that mental health is community health, but community health is also mental health. Housing, healthcare, good therapy built on trust, community environments, friendship, peer supports, peer mentors, home visits from therapists, a stable income, family rehabilitation, a sense of purpose. These are therapeutic environments that lead to better outcomes for people regardless of how their brains function. And I think that lived expertise teaches us this. And so rather than starting from a place of stigmatizing people based on the way that they function and mandating medical care, simply because they may not have access to these resources, I think that we can start asking, how can we better connect people with these resources that allow everyone to thrive? And so returning to this quote that I really like, I think that we should embrace lived expertise to teach us what we do not know and provide the resources that we do know, reduce exclusion, and promote self-defined well-being. And so as I leave you today, I want to challenge you to imagine what might happen if we skipped the forced hospitalization and went straight to a community environment filled with care, safety, financial stability, compassion, regular check-ins, and facilitated independence. What would happen if we started from a place of asking, how can I accommodate you for everything that you are, while also offering robust economic, financial, and housing stability, rather than demanding or enforcing that people change to fit a predetermined normal? What would happen if we didn't withdraw resources because someone is having a moment? And let's start by embracing the fact that when someone is seen and heard and respected as a full person, regardless of their gender, race, sexuality, age, way of thinking, or ability, that they are that much closer to well-being. What if we started by asking what sort of future does lived expertise encourage us to imagine? Thank you.